Hello, everyone. Welcome to Astrologer Climate Witness tonight. I am reading from When Corporations Rule the World by David Korten. I have been looking for this book, and I finally found it in my bookcases. I'm focusing at first on agriculture, corporate agribusiness, okay? Because of the Uranus and Taurus last about 7 years that we've experienced with Uranus and Taurus. Taurus being the first earth sign, Uranus being chaos, upheaval, yes, innovative ideas and invention, technology. Uranus rules technology. But technology really isn't all the answers, okay? So here I am. I'm going to start, and then I'm going to move on. I'm just going to pick things through this book. This is very, again, impromptu. So here we go. The countries that are consuming beyond their environmental means control the rule-making process of the international economy. They adjust the rules to ensure their own ability to make up their national environmental deficits through imports, often without being mindful of the implications for the exporting countries. El Salvador and Costa Rica grow more crops such as bananas, coffee, and sugar on more than 1/5 of their cropland. Export cattle ranches in Latin America and South America have replaced rainforest and wildlife range. Replaced rainforest and wildlife range with cattle ranches in Latin America. At the consumer end of the production line, Japan imports 70% of its corn, wheat, and barley, 95% of its soybeans, and more than 50% of its wood, much of it from the rapidly vanishing rainforests of Borneo. I just posted on my Facebook pictures of a mapping of Borneo from, I think the beginning pictures were in the 1800s. Maybe it was 1950. I don't remember. But it was like 6 pictures or drawn maps showing the reduction in rainforest. At first, it covered the whole continent of Borneo. By the time you get to the end, the last picture, there's less than half of it there, I believe. It's spotty in some places. Okay. In the Netherlands, millions of pigs and cows are fattened on palm kernel cake from the deforested lands in Malaysia, and cassava from deforested regions of Thailand, and soybean from pesticide-dosed expanses in the south of Brazil in order to provide European consumers with their high-fat diet of meat and milk. You see, it's not as bad to have meat and milk if you grow it on your tiny little plot with your couple cows. You have to figure out a way to get food to them in the winter, but, now we use tractors. In the old days, they worked really freaking hard to provide that for their animals. I mean, that's not going to do as much damage, and you can have your meat and milk and cheese. Okay. The lands used by southern countries to produce food for export are unavailable to the poor of those countries to grow the staples they require to meet their own basic needs. The people who are displaced to make way for export-oriented agriculture add to urban overcrowding or move to more fragile and less productive lands that quickly become overstressed. When somebody makes statements about, why cities in some of those other countries are so large, it's because the people have been pushed off their land so that empires can have the land. People worry about other countries buying land here for agriculture. We've been doing it for decades, centuries. So, yeah, tit for tat, right? So the people who are displaced to make way for export-oriented agriculture add to urban overcrowding or move to more fragile and less productive lands that quickly become overstressed. The grains that many southern countries import from the north in exchange for their own food exports are often used primarily as feedstocks to produce meat for upper-income urban consumers. the poor are the double losers. These dynamics are invisible to northern consumers, who, if they raise questions, are assured that this arrangement provides needed jobs and income for the poor of the South, allowing them to meet their food needs more cheaply than if they grew the basic grains themselves. It seems like a plausible theory, but in practice, the only certain beneficiaries of the shift from food economy to trade dependence have been the transnational agribusiness corporations that control the global commodities trade. Just as wealthy countries import resources when their demands exceed their own limits, they also export their surplus waste when the volume exceeds their absorptive capacity. Indeed, waste disposal practices reveal with particular clarity the relationship between power and the allocation of environmental costs. Polluting factories and waste disposal sites are so consistently located in poor and minority neighborhoods or communities that we might use them as proxy indicators of the geographical distribution of political power. Adding insult to injury, the rich commonly point to the miserable environment conditions in which the poor are often forced to live as proof that the poor are less environmentally responsible than the wealthy. Such claims divert attention from two important realities. First, most environmental stress is a direct function of human consumption, and rich unquestionably consume far more than do poor people. Second, poor people are far more likely to live next to waste dumps, polluting factories, and clear-cut forests than wealthy people. But this doesn't mean that the poor people wastes are filling those dumps, or that they are major consumers of the products produced in those factories or from those forests. The same thing happens here. People who've been living in a particular small town, small town, large town, or city, live there for decades and centuries, and then all of a sudden a particular company comes in and wants to develop a manufacturing facility or any other type of polluting, destructive kind of facility, and the place they put it is in the poor communities because they don't have means to fight back like the richer communities. You're not going to see a particular type of manufacturer move into a rich community because they know how to fight with money. They can fight back with money. They're not going to live there. So when people see these poor communities and wonder why they live in such filth, that's why. They don't have an ability to fight back. And these companies can move in, take over, and nobody will say a thing. And they live where there's so much pollution, air pollution, etc. And it's been going on for decades. As long as industrial civilization has happened, and even longer, you know. So, okay, let me try again. Indeed, waste disposal practices reveal the particular clarity of the relationship between power and the allocation of environmental costs. Polluting factories and waste disposal sites are so consistently located in poor and minority neighborhoods or communities that we might use them as proxy indicators of the geographical distribution of political power. Adding insult to injury, the rich commonly point to the miserable environmental conditions in which the poor are often forced to live as proof that the poor are less environmentally responsible than the wealthy. Such claims divert attention from the two important realities. First, most environmental stress is a direct function of human consumption, and rich people unquestionably consume more than do poor people. Second, poor people are far more likely to live next to waste dumps, polluting factories, and clear-cut forests than the wealthy people. But this doesn't mean that the poor people's wastes are filling those dumps, or that they are the major consumers of the products produced in those factories or from those forests. Nor does it mean that they wouldn't prefer to live in a more environmentally pristine setting. It simply means that the wealthy people have the economic and political power to make sure that the pollutants and wastes are dumped somewhere other than in their neighborhoods, and to ensure that their neighborhoods remain pleasantly green and that the polluting factories are located elsewhere. Poor people do not have this power. What we are seeing is a consequence of income inequality, not a difference in environmental awareness and concern. It can be corrected only by equalizing power or stopping industrial civilization. Of course, if we do that, billions of people will die. But if we keep going with industrial civilization, billions of people will die. Economic globalization has greatly expanded opportunities for the rich to pass their environmental burdens to the poor by exporting both waste and polluting factories. This has been a particularly common practice among Japanese companies, with nearby Southeast Asia being a major recipient. The figures are striking. Japan has reduced its domestic aluminum smelting capacity from 1.2 million tons to 140,000 tons and now imports 90% of its aluminum. What this involves in human terms is suggested by a case study of the Philippine Associated Smelting and Refining Corporation, PASAR. PASAR operates a Japanese-financed and constructed copper smelting plant in the Philippine province of Leyte to produce high-grade copper cathodes for shipment to Japan. The plant occupies 400 acres of land expropriated by the Philippine government from local residents at giveaway prices. Gas and wastewater emissions from the plant contain high concentrations of boron, arsenic, heavy metal, and sulfur compounds that have contaminated local water supplies, reduced fishing and rice yields, damaged the forest, and increased the occurrence of upper respiratory diseases among local residents. Local people whose homes, livelihoods, and health have been sacrificed to PESAR now largely depend on the occasional part-time or contractual employment they are offered to do the plant's most dangerous and dirtiest jobs. The company has prospered. The local economy has grown. The Japanese people have a supply of copper at no environmental cost to themselves. The local poor, the project's professed beneficiaries, have lost their means of livelihood and suffer impaired health. The Philippine government is repaying the foreign aid loan from Japan that financed the construction of supporting infrastructure for the plant. And Japanese are congratulating themselves for the cleanliness of their domestic environment and their generous assistance to the poor of Philippines. There is nothing particularly special about this case other than the fact that it has been documented. Thousands of similar stories illustrate the realities of corporate globalization. The Economist, an ardent globalization proponent, has argued that those who criticize such toxic dumping practices would deprive the poor of needed economic opportunity. Although an open trading system is sometimes advocated as necessary to make up for the environmental deficits of those who have too little, it more often works in exactly the opposite way, increasing the environmental deficits of those who have too little to provide additional environmental resources for those who already have more than their need. Furthermore, an open trading system makes it easier for the rich to keep the consequences of this transfer out of their own sight. The further out of sight those consequences are, the easier it is for those who hold power to ignore or rationalize them. You know, we hear this and we say, well, how are you going to live if you stop industrial civilization? I'm not here to put out some kind of solutions to this. There are none. We are in it. It is destructive. You need to depend on it, more or less, to live. Even the person like myself who lives in the country, if I were to completely give up my electric, I do believe there'd be some kind of zoning problem with that, I think, because of sewer and all that. But I try my best to reduce my stress on the environment. My clothes are on the line. I'll have to take them off here in a few minutes. It's going to get damp. It's getting late. And I've gone through this before. I used to live in Long Island. I didn't have a car for a long time, but I eventually got one down there because I had to get to work. It was much more convenient than 2 or 3 buses to get to work. But we we have to look at this by standing way back and seeing in industrial civilization for what it is. It's a super organism. I didn't come up with that. That's been going around for a while. I forget who started it. It's like an amoeba. It in order to function and to live, it has to consume its environment. And industrial civilization is the problem. We take for granted that this is normal, or many people do, because they don't give much thought to what came before. And usually when they do, they think of like the 1800s, right? No, that was not a natural system either. It was a little better. It was a little better. We didn't have, heavy use of fossil fuels. And it was still somewhat destructive. I mean, there was coal. We've been using coal since somewhere in the middle of the 1700s, starting in England. And that was really destructive. So, what my point is, some people on the extreme left do state, and this is true, that the maximum power principle, which I've probably talked about here before, requires a species to use all forms of energy in its environment in order to survive. Okay, are we just any species? I mean, we are part of the fabric of the earth, the network of life. We're not better than. But we do have this brain that tells us, especially through science, what we're doing to our planet. And that's been going on for a decade upon decade. Even before Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's book. We knew what we were doing. The scientists did. And they spread it to some people. But those in business and in the financial world do not care. They, even if some of them do to some small smidgen, they think they can get around it by becoming more efficient, saving here and saving there. It doesn't matter. When I was born in the 50s, there was 2 billion people on the planet. There's 8 billion now. Everybody using the benefits of industrial civilization. That's not going to go on. The Seneca Cliff is something that I've been thinking about again lately. I was introduced to it over a decade ago. And it's when the tipping points get to take effect. And that rising curve of progress that we experience gets to the top, plateaus very momentarily, and then whoosh. We've been plateauing. People worry, themselves to death about inflation, etc. You ain't seen nothing yet. Once climate change, catastrophes begin to affect crop growth even more, you're going to be paying out the kazoo for food. Now, yes, some people who live in the country can grow some of their food, but myself, like this year, I got no green beans. I've never had that problem. I've been growing green beans for 20 years. Pole beans, mostly, so I don't have to bend over so much. So I got blossoms really late. I planted them the same time I always do, and I used heirloom seeds. Planted them the same times I always do. The blossoms didn't come. The blossoms didn't come. Finally, they showed up. I'm still waiting. I still have blossoms, and I have no beans. So I looked it up. One of the reasons is because the ground might be too wet. And that is the case because we've been getting rainstorm after rainstorm, and when it rains, it pours for hours. And I've gone out there, and I could see where the garden was flooded by about probably this much, somewhere around in there, because the grass, everything, the bottom of the plants, all had that dusty mud on it when it dried up. one of my pumpkins was totally just, rotted. Some of my tomatoes. So, no beans. Now, now and then over the time that old timers used to have gardens, they'd have bad years. This is going to be happening more and more and more. So that even the person who grows a garden to try to make it on their own without industrial agriculture is going to experience this type of thing. Collapse is a process. It's not like a movie where all of a sudden everything goes to crap. Except down the road, who knows exactly when, but down the road when we hit that Seneca cliff, and then, all that up, up, up like a roller coaster, up, 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 and you could hear the chain, and you get to the top and swoosh, down the other side of that cliff. And there's not enough resources, there's not enough food, etc., and everything goes apart. You're not going to have the health care that we have, even now, which in the United States isn't great. You're not going to have even water, because you have to have a functioning infrastructure in order to have water. People think that when you talk about climate change and people dying, they think, oh, all these people are going to die in a flood, or all these people are going to die from drought. Well, that's part of it, because starvation, yeah. But it's a slow process. It's not going to be one or a couple of events. Many events over time will bring down the infrastructure of industrial civilization. And that's what's happening. The insurance industry, look into that and see what's going on with that. That starts the economy itself to experience roller coaster rides. And then again, we are just at the beginning of this. If you've been watching some of the catastrophes that have happened, then you get a clue as to how the infrastructure of industrial civilization is at risk from climate disasters. But there's more than that. There's the acidification of the oceans. There is stratification of the oceans, not a good thing. There's, because of that, there's the slowing of the AMOC, Atlantic Meridional Oscillation Current. So I know I've talked about these things before, but I like to bring it up again because who knows who watched the last video. Okay, let me see what else I can find here. Let's see. This might be good. We have endured far too many debates in which the representatives of rich countries condemn the population growth of the poor and refuse to discuss overconsumption and inequality, and the representatives of poor countries refuse to discuss population growth. In a full world, consumption, population, and equity are inseparably linked. It's not just one thing, and must be dealt with holistically. The 3 studies illustrate those links. The first is a study by William Rees, very well known in our circles, an urban planner at the University of British Columbia. Rees estimates that 4 to 6 hectares of land are required to maintain the consumption of an average person living in a high-income country, including the land that would be required to maintain current levels of energy consumption using renewable resources or renewable sources. In 1990, the total available ecologically productive land area, land capable of generating consequential biomass, in the world was estimated to be 1.7 hectares per capita. This is per person. Rees estimates that the population of the Netherlands, for example, consumes an output equivalent of some 14 times as much productive land as is contained within its borders. The deficits of the Netherlands and other industrial countries is covered up in part by drawing down their own natural resource stocks, and in part through international trade that allows them to expropriate the resources of lower income countries. Among the industrial countries, per capita resource consumption is generally highest in the United States and Canada. However, since Europe and Japan have higher population densities, the case can be made that they are living even further beyond their own ecological means. Tit for tat, it's about the same. A study by Friends of the Earth Netherlands took such an analysis a step further, asking what would be the allowable annual levels of consumption, environmental resources and waste absorption services for the average Dutch person in the year 2010. Now, this book is a little older, but it's very on point. Okay, Dutch person in the year 2010, if a resource consumption levels are equal among all people living on the earth at that time, and the global level of resource consumption is sustainable. The results are sobering. The researchers found that in almost every area of consumption, the average person in the Netherlands is consuming far beyond his or her means and is thereby depriving people in poorer countries of the ability to meet their basic needs. And then we wonder why people are immigrating. And now it's worse because their environment that they need to use to grow food, subsistence growing, their own little patch. The climate is destroying that ability. They cannot grow the food that they've been able to grow for hundreds and hundreds of years. This is happening a lot in South America. It's going to get worse. We have had the benefits of fossil fuels. They have had the stick. So it's really sad that people can't see this. It is mind-boggling that people don't try. All they care about is their own situation. And they listen to people who create fear in a way that divides so that we can't all work together to create at least some kind of support for people in general. It's going to get harder and harder to do that, even if we are working. But the effort is what counts. The understanding is what counts. The empathy and compassion is what counts. Ooh, that sun is something else, huh? Let's see. Friends of the Earth USA, long day, applied the Dutch estimates to the United States and reached a similar conclusion. For example, current annual per capita carbon dioxide emissions are 19.5 tons in the United States and 12 tons in the Netherlands. Remember, that's per capita, per person. To meet suggested targets for the reduction of global warming, world per capita carbon dioxide emissions levels from fossil fuel use must be brought down to 4 tons by 2010. If the burden of achieving this target were shared equitably, each person would be reduced in 2010 to consuming no more than 1 liter of carbon-based fuel per day. A Dutch person will be given the choice of traveling 24 kilometers or 15.5 miles by car, 50 kilometers or 31 miles by bus, 65 kilometers, 40 miles by train, or 10 kilometers, 6.2 miles by plane per day. A flight from Amsterdam to Rio de Janeiro can probably be undertaken only once every 20 years. For those whose only transportation option is walking, such standards may seem luxurious. They are sobering indeed. However, for those of us accustomed to spending much of our lives in cars, planes, buses, and trains, it is even more sobering to note that our allowance of 1 liter of fuels a day is our allowance not only for direct personal travel, but for the fuels used to produce, transport, and market the items we consume as well. That's just not what you're using to get around. It's for everything that you use, everything that's produced for you to use. Okay. Burdens we place on the environment, but never see and tend to neglect. A third study presented at the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science by Cornell University, which is not far from me, less than an hour. Professor David Pimentel and his colleagues asked similar questions, but also looked at interactions among sectors and took population as a variable. For example, the study took into account that although we might cultivate more land, doing so would require more water. We could get more of our energy from the sun, but only by using more land. Each hectare of agriculture land could produce higher yields, but only by using more energy inputs, more fertilizer, which is manufactured by using fossil fuels. Okay, here we go. The Cornell researchers also took into account that although we continue to bring new land under cultivation, 10 million hectares of productive arable land are already being abandoned each year due to severe degradation. These abandoned lands must be replaced simply to maintain existing food consumption levels. An additional 5 million hectares of new land must be put into production to feed the annual net addition to the world population before making any dent in reducing existing malnutrition. Most of this new agricultural land comes from clearing forests. The Cornell research team concluded that the Earth can sustain a population of 1 or 2 billion people consuming at a level roughly equivalent to the current per capita standard of Europe, which is lower than the United States. To highlight the trade-off involved, they posed a fundamental question. Does human society want 10 to 15 billion humans living in poverty and malnourishment, or 1 or 2 billion living with abundant resources and quality environment? The calculations presented by all three studies are at best preliminary approximations based on controversial assumptions and use of fragmented and often unreliable data. They are, however, important to any realistic discussion of sustainability. I know a lot of people on the right hate that word, but we don't live on a magical planet. As they bring into focus the inescapable relationship in a full world between consumption, population, and equity, and to point to 3 important realities. First, if the Earth's sustainable natural output were shared equally among the Earth's present population, the needs of all could be met. This is an older book, okay? So, we have even more people than when he wrote this. Second, it is a physical impossibility, even with the most optimistic assumptions about the potential of new technologies, for all the world's people to consume at levels even approximating those in North America, Europe, and Japan. Third, each doubling of world population reduces each individual's share of the Earth's regenerative output by half. If we are to have a world that works for all, we must free ourselves of the myth that economic growth is the foundation of human progress, and direct our attention to ending overconsumption, deprivation, population growth, and inequality, all of which are inextricably linked. Okay, there's that. So, we are not giving up growth. You can see that. With the current political situation, we have a psychopath on one side. I know, I'm being, political here. I don't care because that's the reality. A narcissist psychopath. And the other side, you have someone who is, brainwashed to believe the industrial paradigm of growth, etc. Modern industrial civilization is the be-all and end-all. But I will say this. The person on the left, if that's what you want to call it, the Democrats, at least, they discuss social justice. Okay. You don't want to live in Gilead, do we? Do we want to live in Gilead? I mean, when you've got states and people in the government of a state talking about keeping track of a woman's period so they know when she's pregnant, so they can keep track and make her have the baby. I mean, where in the world has the species gone? We are completely delusional. And that is my next chapter here. It says the growth illusion, the growth illusion. So I will be voting for a Democrat. I voted third party last time. No, in 2016. I wish I could vote third party, but there's not a shot. And I can't throw my vote away this time because it's too important. So, anyway, the growth illusion. To address poverty, economic growth is not an option. It is an imperative. That was spoken by the president of the vice president of the World Bank, and I can't pronounce his name. Oh, Mahab al-Haq. Okay. Economic growth provides the conditions in which protection of the environment can be best achieved. International Chamber of Commerce. So that's what they believe, and that's been the paradigm for thousands of years, really. Progress, progress. Let's get bigger and better. That's what they believe. Continue to read. Perhaps no single idea is more deeply embedded in modern political culture than the belief that economic growth is the key to meeting most important human needs, including alleviating poverty and protecting the environment. Anyone who dares to speak of environmental limits to growth risks being dismissed out of hand as an anti-poor doomsayer. Thus, most environmentalists call simply for a different kind of growth, although it is seldom evident that what kind it would be. Nobel laureate economist Jan Tinberger and his distinguished colleague Rufi Huiting, I think that's how you say it, point out that there are two ways for an economy to grow, according to our current mode of reckoning. One is to increase the number of people employed. The other is to increase the labor productivity, the value of output per worker. And you see another thing about the Uranus and Taurus, it's in the 6th house of the United States now, right? So this is very relevant, talking about workers, employees, etc., the worker-employee relationship. Okay. About 70% of this productivity growth has been in the 30% of economic activity accounted for by the petroleum, petrochemical, and metal industries, chemical-intensive agriculture, public utilities, road building and transportation, and mining. Specifically, the industries that are the most rapidly drawing down natural capital, generating the bulk of our most toxic wastes, and consuming a substantial portion of our non-renewable energy reserves. Okay. If you're not used to hearing any of this, that's okay. Everybody starts somewhere. I started somewhere way back in the early 2000s. Didn't know any of this. Cowboys in a spaceship. Furthermore, the most environmentally burdensome ways of meeting a given need are generally those that contribute most to the gross domestic product, GDP. For example, driving a mile in a car contributes more to GDP than riding a mile on a bicycle. Turning on an air conditioner adds more than opening a window. Relying on processed packaged foods adds more than using natural foods purchased in bulk in reusable containers. My God, I would love that. They took that away. They started it in the 80s, but they took it away. We might say that GDP, technically, a measure of the rate at which money is flowing through the economy, might also be described as a measure of the rate at which we are turning resources into garbage. I hate garbage. We could expend a lot of effort on the probably unrealistic goal of making GDP go up indefinitely without creating more garbage. Yeah. But why not instead concentrate on ending poverty, improving our quality of life, and achieving a balance with Earth? These are achievable goals. If we can free ourselves from the illusion that growth is the path to a better life. The Disillusioned Economist. In 1954, R.A. Butler, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, executor spoke to Conservative Party conference in which he pointed out that a 3% annual growth rate would double the national income per capita by 1980 and make every man and woman twice as rich as his or her father had been at the same age. The speech proved to be a turning point in British life. Previously, national goals had been set in terms of specific targets, such as building 300,000 houses a year or establishing a national health service. Henceforth, the primary goal would be economic growth. The ideological debate between the left and the right as to how a fixed pie would be distributed was largely diffused. Attention centered on how to increase the size of the pie. In 1989, Irish economist Richard Douthwaite set out to document the benefits of the subsequent doubling of Britain's per capita income. In his own words, problems only arose when I attempted to identify what they, in parentheses, the benefits, were, especially as it quickly became apparent that almost every social indicator had worsened over the third of a century the experiment had taken. I'm going to read that one again. Problems only arose when I attempted to identify what they, the benefits, were, especially as it quickly became apparent that almost every social indicator had worsened over the third of a century the experiment had taken. Chronic disease had increased, crime had gone up eightfold, unemployment had soared, and many more marriages were ending in divorce. Well, there's another reason for that. We won't go into that right now. Almost frantically, I looked for gain to set against those losses, which in most cases I felt had to be blamed on growth. Oh boy. Eventually, I gave up. The weight of evidence was overwhelming. The unquestioning quest for growth had been an unmitigated social and environmental disaster. Almost all the extra resources the process had created had been used to keep the system functioning in an increasingly inefficient way. The new wealth had been squandered on producing pallets and corrugated cardboard, non-returnable bottles, and ring-pull drink cans. It had built airports, supertankers, and heavy goods lorries, motorways, flyovers, and car parks with many floors. Had enabled the banking, insurance, and stock brokering, tax collecting, and accounting sector to expand from 493,000 to 2,475,000 employees during the 33 years. It had financed the recruitment of over 3 million people to the reserve army of the unemployed. Very little was left for more positive achievements when all these had taken their share. We might apply a similar test to the more than five-fold increase in global output since 1950. The advocates of growth persistently maintain that economic growth is the key to ending poverty, stabilizing population, protecting the environment, and achieving social harmony. Yet, during this same period, the number of people living in absolute poverty has kept pace with population growth. Both have doubled. The ratio of the share of the world's income going to the richest 20% to that going to the bottom 20% poor has doubled, and indicators of social and environmental disintegration have risen sharply nearly everywhere. Although economic growth did not necessarily create these problems, it certainly has not solved them. The limits of growth. Few would dispute that there has been real and consequential human progress over the past several centuries, and that advances in technology and consequent productivity increases have resulted in real gains in human well-being. At the same time, as this chapter elaborates, there is little basis for assuming that economic growth, as we currently define and measure it, results in automatic increases in human welfare. As British economist Paul Ekins points out, it is possible to conclude that a particular instance of growth has been a good thing only by showing that the growth has taken place through the production of goods and services that are inherently valuable and beneficial, which most of our products are not, demonstrating that these goods and services have been distributed widely through the society, and proving that these benefits outweigh any detrimental effects of the growth process on other parts of society. Our measures of GDP make no such distinction. Indeed, a major portion of what shows up as growth in GDP is a result of shifting activities from the non-money social economy of household and community to the money economy, with the consequent erosion of social capital. Depleting natural resource stocks such as forests, fisheries, and oil and mineral reserves at far above their recovery rates. Counting as income the cost of defending ourselves against consequences of growth, such as disposing of waste, cleaning up toxic dumps and oil spills, providing health care for victims of environmentally caused illnesses, and rebuilding after floods resulting from human activities such as deforestation and financing pollution controlling devices. Okay. Yeah, they throw all that negative stuff in GDP growth. Cute. Standard financial accounting deducts from income as an allowance for the depreciation of capital assets. The economic accounting system by which economic growth is measured makes no comparable adjustment for the depletion of social and natural capital. Indeed, the economic accounting counts many costs of economic growth as economic gains. I'll say that again. Indeed, economic accounting counts many costs of economic growth as economic gains, even though they really reduce rather than increase our well-being. The results are sometimes ludicrous. For example, the cost of cleaning up the Exxon Valdez oil spill on the Alaska coast and the cost of repairing damage from the terrorist bombing of the World Trade Center in New York both counted as net contributions to economic output. According to this distorted logic, disasters that are tragic for people and the environment are beneficial to society? What? In their book For the Common Good, Herman Daly and John Cobb Jr. reconstruct the national income accounts for the United States for 1960s to 1986, counting only those increases in output that relate to improvements in well-being and adjusting downward for the depletion of human and environmental resources. The result is an index of real economic welfare rather than simply aggregate output. Their index reveals that, on average, individuals' welfare in the United States peaked in 1969. Let's see, I was 11, 12, going on 12. Then it remained on a plateau and fell during the early to mid 1980s. You see, this doesn't necessarily equate to what politicians can do within the system that we're in. You would need a complete flip in order for that to be fixed. And there's not a single politician that'll do that. So, when people are ranting and raving about inflation, there's not much they can do. Maybe a little bit of tweaks here and there, but we're going down the hill. It's only going to get more difficult. Okay. The result is an index of real economic welfare rather than simply aggregate output. That's the key word, aggregate output. Okay. Their index reveals that, on average, individual welfare in the United States peaked in 1969, then remained on a plateau and fell during the early and mid-80s. Yet, from 1969 to 1986, GNP per person went up by 35%, and fossil fuel consumption increased by around 17%. Gross national product. I think it's their output, workers' output. I think that's what that is. The main consequence of this growth has been that most of us are now working harder to maintain a declining quality of life. Often how the economic pie is allocated is more important to our well-being than its absolute size. United Nations Development Program, UNDP, studies show that it is not necessary to have particularly high economic output for a country to meet the basic needs of its people. In fact, some countries with relatively modest economic output do better in this regard than other countries with much higher GDP. Saudi Arabia's literacy rate is lower than Sri Lanka's, despite the fact that per capita income is 15 times higher. Brazil's child mortality rate is 4 times that of Jamaica, even though its per capita income is twice as high. Obviously, some minimum level of economic output is essential to meet basic needs, and this required level is probably a good deal higher than the current output of the world's poorest countries. However, for most of the world's population, people, the question of whether their basic needs are met depends less on the absolute level of per capita income than on how productive output is allocated. If the priority is to provide people with a good diet, shelter, clothing, clean water, healthcare, basic transport, education, and other essentials of good living, then it is within the means of most countries to do so and thus alleviate human deprivation within existing levels of productive output. In many instances, it would require little more than reallocating the resources now devoted to military purposes. How many people think that's going to happen? Clean water and proper sanitation are perhaps the most important contributions to good health and long life. Experience in places such as the state of Kerala in India prove that such necessities can be provided at quite modest income levels. By contrast, countries with high income levels are experiencing increases in rates of cancer, respiration illness, stress, and cardiovascular disease and birth defects, as well as falling sperm counts. A growing body of evidence links all these phenomena to the byproducts of economic growth: air and water pollution, chemical additives and pesticide residues in food, high noise levels, and increased exposure to electromagnetic radiation. Suburbanization, greater dependence on the automobile for mobility, and increased use of television for entertainment are associated with economic growth. Each has reduced the normal human contact and interaction that used to be a regular part of the village and urban life as people met on paths and sidewalks, created family and community entertainment, and congregated in local shops and coffee stalls. You see, the right seems to think that the extreme left is against these things, anti-child and all that. No, you know, we're for the individual, the community, the family, the community, the region, to have more autonomy over how they live from day to day and where they get the resources from. And also kind of, what resources they use, like what their consumption is. I mean, many families talk about how we overconsume, but they keep doing it. They keep piling on the Christmas presents with your kids and go buy new Christmas decorations all the time. And, think about the energy used for Christmas decorations. And then, sometimes you save some from year to year, but still in the long run, it's just the littlest thing that you buy that's so frivolous. Yeah. Uses massive amounts of energy. Each has reduced the normal human cut. Okay, I read that. Rapid economic growth in low-income countries brings modern airports, television, express highways, and air-conditioned shopping malls with sophisticated consumer electronics and fashion labels for the fortunate few. It rarely improves living conditions for many. This kind of growth requires gearing the economy toward exports to earn foreign exchange to buy the things that wealthy people desire. Thus, the lands of the poor are appropriated for export crops. The former tillers of these lands then find themselves subsisting in urban slums on starvation wages paid by sweatshops producing items for export. Families are broken up and the social fabric is strained to the breaking point, and violence becomes endemic. Those whom growth has favored then need still more foreign exchange to import arms to protect themselves from the rage of the excluded. What a vicious cycle. All right, that's all for tonight, folks. But a lot of that pertains to Uranus and Taurus. The value we place on land or not, what we think we're going to get for ourselves out of it. This book, even though he wrote it in the 2000s, Let me see, I forgot what the copyright is on this. It's pretty early. Copyright. 1995, excuse me. It was his other book, The Great Turning, that was in the 2000s. 1995, he wrote this. This isn't new. And, you know, there's been naturalists for decade upon decade talking about the changes that we're making because of industrial civilization. It's not normal. It's not sustainable. And every time somebody says that word, you're going to think, oh, you know, they want to use solar panels and wind turbines to make the world sustainable. No, they're not sustainable because all they're doing is propping up industrial civilization. So, you know, how are you supposed to save 8 billion people when you really can't? Because if you keep trying, you're killing the planet. So, you know, there's people working on various things. Some people think that the fossil companies are going to come up with their carbon capture and it's going to work, and they're going to come up with their green hydrogen and their blue hydrogen, you know, some hydrogen that's going to be made with solar energy, etc. Yeah. So next time I think I know what I'm going to be using, but this Uranus and Taurus is coming to a close, and when it hits the 29th degree, beware. Because all of this misuse of the land, ecosystems, habitats for us and our animal friends is going to show how our abuse has destroyed it and our living, supporting biosphere. It's going to be really tough. There's going to be more after that to show us, but that Uranus and Taurus, I don't think it's going to end well. 29 degrees. Actually, that's opposite my sun by exact. That ought to be interesting. All right, that's it for tonight. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned from this. Oh, I was supposed to finish the associations of astrology. My camera just automatically quit last time at Libra. I pretty much covered Libra. There was some other things I thought of, but I'm gonna have to work on that. The rest of that. Just trying to correlate astrology to the natural world and doing that through how astrology uses association to show commonality between things, how we're all connected. Okay, so goodbye for tonight. Take care. See you next time on Astrologer Climate Witness. Bye.